Hi guys, hope you're all okay. I think I finally found a microphone that makes my voice not sound like a robot, so it's not perfect, but it'll do for now, I think, in terms of trying to get some information to you. So we're going to go over the immigration work that I set you last week in terms of looking at the advantages and disadvantages of immigration. I've looked through the work that you've sent me, and I think the vast majority of you have it absolutely right. I think, again, like I've said in the emails, the quality of the work that you're sending through, those of you that are, is absolutely fantastic. You're really on the right track, and you're doing some really detailed notes, so they'll really help you next year when we come to look at, answering exam questions on these sorts of things. But when you come to revise as well, it'll make it a hell of a lot easier for you. Okay, so to start with, I want you to have a look at all of these people. First of all, do you know who they are? And secondly, what do they all have in common? So I've got the first one. Hopefully you know that's Mo Farah. Second one, do you know who he is? It's Prince Philip. I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't know who this guy was. He's called Michael Marks. Rita Ora. Michael Marks, by the way, was one of the founders of Marks and Spencer. Rita Ora and Victor Moses. Do you know what they all have in common, all of those people? They all come from outside of the UK, so they're all immigrants. Mo Farah came from Ethiopia. He is German, Greek. He came from, I think, Israel. I'd have to double check that. Rita Ora is from Kosovo. Victor Moses, I think he's from Kenya, Nigeria. Is he from Nigeria? You guys probably have a better idea than I do. So the point that I'm trying to make there, obviously, the UK is very divided on immigration, as you probably saw during the Brexit debacle. But in terms of immigration, it can bring a hell of a lot to a country. Now, we've got to try and put sort of personal feelings aside about immigration when we're talking about it in terms of economics. We've got to put the economic arguments forward for it and against it, obviously, rather than turning into like a Daily Mail sort of article whereby you just completely go down on your own personal feelings. I think you probably know what my personal feelings are about it, but I'll try not to show any sort of bias. But going from these people that we've just looked at, obviously they bring a very diverse, well, maybe not him so much, but the rest of them, they bring a very diverse set of skills and culture to the UK. And that's something that's maybe not necessarily measurable always in economic terms. So in terms of the advantages, have a think about things like fruit pickers. These have been in the news recently. Medical staff, and that's medical staff from porters in hospitals to carers to nurses to doctors, consultants, the full range of people that work for the medical profession. Builders are another one. These are people that fill skills shortages in the UK. So bringing in people from other countries, we end up with this greater variety of skills. It can reduce our skills shortages. Think about the articles that have been in newspapers over recent weeks. They're worrying about not being able to have enough fruit and vegetable pickers for the summer, because usually every summer there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of people come over, generally from Eastern Europe, but from all over the place to pick fruit and vegetables in the UK, in UK farms, in British farms. We haven't got the workforce for that. It's not an unskilled profession. It's hard work. They're working very long shifts in fields, in farms, and they have to know how to do it quickly as well. You can't just take somebody who's been furloughed from a job in banking or an office job and stick them in a field and hope that they'll be able to do the same as the other fruit pickers. So to allow the immigration, we have this reduction in skills shortages. We then end up with a more diverse and productive workforce, and you know that if your workforce is more productive, then long-run aggregate supply increases. If long-run aggregate supply increases, that's the best kind of economic growth, because that's your potential economic growth there. The productive capacity of the country is increased. If there's an increase in long run aggregate supply, there can also be an increase in, it's like an increase in your TPF as well. So you're able to produce more as an economy. So therefore it's better to allow the immigration to allow you to be more productive. Another advantage, you end up with a larger working age population. Now, again, contrary to what a lot of sort of Brexiteers might want you to believe, the vast majority of people who are immigrants to most countries are there to work. They're not there to claim benefits and things like that. They're there to actually work and earn a living. I think it's quite sort of stuck up that some British people think that people only come here for the benefits. Or for the wonderful weather or whatever they think. They're coming here because there's an opportunity to have a profession and to earn a wage. The larger working age population, hopefully they will be earning. That leads to an increase in demand in an economy. So people are earning, people are wanting to spend. If there's an increase in demand, then there's likely to be an increase in consumption. More people are spending, more consumption. And if they're earning and they're spending, then there's an increase in tax revenue for the government. So positives on both sides. That means that firms are getting greater profits because there's more consumption going on. And then possibly it could lead to more government spending. It's not guaranteed. It could just be that they have more tax revenue and that helps with the budget deficit. But it could lead to more government spending. Both of those things would lead to an increase in aggregate demand, which leads to an increase in economic growth. Now, there's something with the greater government spending and possibly greater profits, which could lead to greater investment. There's something that should immediately flag up into your mind when you think of those two things, and that's the circular flow of income. So think about the multiplier effect. If there is more government spending and there is more investment that's come about from profits, then that could trigger the multiplier effect. The increase in demand up here will lead to an increase in jobs. If there's more jobs available, then more people will be earning more, and so on. So immigration could actually trigger a multiplier effect as well. Another advantage, sticking with the larger working age population, you've got this increase in labour supply. So there's more people coming into work, you've got more workers available. That could push down the equilibrium wage. Now we'll look at this from both sides of the coin really. But if you think about supply and demand for anything, labour is exactly the same, apart from the fact it's people, but it works in exactly the same way. If you increase the supply of it, then the price will go down. So if you increase the supply of potatoes, for example, the market price would go down. If you increase the supply of workers, the price would go down. So the equilibrium wage falls. Now we're looking at advantages here, so we have to try and figure out how to spin this as an advantage. And it means that the cost of production would fall. So this is good for firms. If the cost of production falls, that affects short-run aggregate supply, that pushes short-run aggregate supply out, and that leads to economic growth as well, and likely a downwards pressure on prices. Now, obviously, to evaluate, we have to think about that. Is that good for everybody? Clearly not. If you're somebody whose wage has just fallen, that's not good for you. It's good for firms, possibly good for the economy. There's maybe more competition, so only the best people get the jobs. But it's not good for everybody. Another thing to think about is something called sticky wages. It's a term that you can actually use. It's a proper economics term. Wages do go up sometimes, but they're very unlikely to actually go down. It's very demotivating when firms put wages down, so they end up with less productive labour. So the likelihood of wages falling can be questioned with this sticky wages idea. And the other kind of evaluation, yes, it's maybe good for firms, but it leads to a lot of social unrest and racism, the whole "they took our jobs" sort of thing. So it can perhaps be good for firms, but not necessarily good for the whole economy and for society as a whole. In terms of the disadvantages, you've got your larger population. If you've got a larger population, then there's likely to be an increase in demand for public services. Things like the health service, schools, council houses, perhaps, things like that. To fund that, the government would either have to increase tax, or they would increase their budget deficit, as in they're spending more than they're getting in. If they were to increase tax, then there'd be a decrease in disposable income. If they didn't increase tax, then they'd be increasing the national debt, and obviously the cost of servicing that debt, as we saw in fiscal policy, means that there's less money to spend on other things as they're having to pay interest on that debt. And so in terms of long-term growth, A decrease in disposable income would mean that aggregate demand would fall. An increase in national debt is likely to mean that there's less investment, there's less government spending, so therefore there's less long-term growth. Now, you could argue if there's an increase in government spending, as in they're having to spend more on the NHS or spend more on schools, then that could actually increase aggregate demand. Remember, government spending is a component of aggregate demand. It very much depends on how they're actually having to fund that. So if they're increasing taxes, then maybe the decrease in consumption would outweigh the increase in government spending. It's worth considering that. The other thing it's worth considering as well, there's an increase in demand for public services, but again, as we've seen really clearly over the last few weeks and months, the people that are immigrants are also staffing the public services. So as soon as you cut off immigration, you're cutting off a supply of labour for your public services. So the people that are working in the NHS, for example, a hell of a lot of people that weren't born in the UK are now keeping the country afloat, or delivery drivers, people that work in factories that are making essential products and things, people that work in supermarkets, Amazon delivery drivers, that sort of thing. A lot of those are people that weren't born in the UK. So yes, there's an increase in demand for public services, but they're also providing more public services. So that could outweigh that one. These are sort of evaluation points to consider. Another disadvantage, you've got a larger population. There might be an increase in demand for housing. So that could be buying houses or renting. Both of those, with supply and demand, that would push up house prices, or it could push up rent, especially in areas whereby there's a large percentage of immigrants, perhaps, because there's suddenly an increase in demand in an area, and obviously the housing market is quite slow to respond in terms of it takes a couple of years to build houses. They can't just throw them up overnight. The housing's less affordable, so therefore it increases poverty, maybe relative poverty. It increases inequality because the people that have houses are okay. The people that don't, it makes it harder for them to buy houses or harder for them to rent. If there's an increase in relative poverty, there could be an increase in social tensions as well. So it doesn't matter so much if you look at it this way, if the poor are happy with what they have, if lower income households are happy with what they have, they don't care so much about what higher income households have. If they're not happy with what they have, as in if they can't even afford rent or they can't afford housing, then that's when the social tensions occur. Now, the thing to think about there, who's it actually good for? So again, we're evaluating if there's an increase in house prices or an increase in rent, that's good for the people that own their own homes. And if you remember, it's 60% of the UK own their own homes. So actually, for some people, that's really, really good. That could actually help drive the economy. If house prices are going up, you've got the positive wealth effect going on. It's also good for landlords, I suppose, if rent's going up. But again, both of those things would lead to an increase in inequality because you've got the people that have moving further away from the people that have not. The final disadvantage, you've got a larger working age population. So you've got an increase in the supply of labour. Now, this is the other side of the coin to what we looked at before. Fall in equilibrium wage because there's more labour available, decrease in disposable income, which would increase inequality, leads to a decrease in consumption and therefore a decrease in growth as well. This has been argued to have happened in things like the building industry, whereby workers have come in from Romania and other countries, and they've accepted a lower wage. Now, I've put there, how likely is this to happen? Obviously, we've got a national minimum wage. It's a legal requirement that the government pays workers the national minimum wage that's appropriate for their age group. It very much depends on the morals of these employers, really. Some of them would pay cash in hand and they'd pay less than the national minimum wage. People coming in that are desperate for a job would take that. And maybe that's how you get people living, in houses of multiple occupancy, whereby their rent is relatively low, but their wages aren't even national minimum wage. So you could question how likely it is to happen. Yes, we do have a national minimum wage system set up, so maybe the fall in equilibrium wage, there is a wage floor perhaps legally, but maybe it would encourage kind of illegal practices. It very much depends on the power of employers as well. So not only the morality of employers, but the power. So monopsonies are where there's one big employer. So not like it's a bit like a monopoly where there's one seller. A monopsony is where there's one buyer, and they are a buyer of labour. So if you think of the NHS, they're a monopsony in terms of medical staff. Yes, there are private healthcare hospitals and trusts and things like that, but the biggest employer by a long way, if you're working in the medical profession, is the NHS. Now they're obviously government run, so they shouldn't drive down wages to the point where people are living in poverty. I won't get into that now because I don't think they're paying people anywhere near enough. But the employers, say for example, new home builders, they are very big employers and they can set the wages at what they want. So it very much depends on the power of these employers. It could be that there is a fall in the equilibrium wage if there's an increase in the supply of labour, if there are monopsonies. However, if they're working in more of a kind of competitive industry, whereby there's lots of different employers, perhaps delivery drivers, or like the hospitality sector where there's lots of different employers, then perhaps the employers don't have that much power that they need to actually keep the wage above the equilibrium, or they need to keep the wage at the national minimum wage, because if they don't, then the workers will go elsewhere. So it very much depends on that as well, and that's worth looking at in terms of your evaluation as well. So hopefully that's helped a little bit in terms of the advantages, disadvantages. Remember, in terms of your evaluation, you need to be critical to all of these points that we've come up with, all of these that we've talked about. Every time you think of an extra point, you need to think, okay, well, how would this affect this group of people, or how likely is that to happen, or how significant is that to happen, and so on. So it's being critical all the way through, which is the kind of practice that we need to be getting into now, really. Okay, so I'm just about to start marking your multiple choice questions that have come in so far. Don't worry if they're not in yet. Hopefully the rest of them will be in by the end of today. And then I'll feed back to you individually as to what your mark is. And then I'll have a look at doing some feedback for that as well in terms of how to answer the actual questions. Okay, hope you're all keeping well and stay safe, and I'll see you soon.